Good afternoon and welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's Curator's Corner. My name is Thorin Tritter. I am the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center located in beautiful Glen Cove, New York. This online program, as you may know, is part of a regular series of programs that we launched when our building was closed due to the corona crisis. I'm happy to say that our building has reopened, although we strongly urge people to schedule their visits in advance to assure that we can maintain proper spacing in our galleries. We're going to be closed tomorrow, Thursday and Friday. We're opening again on Sunday. But anyway, even with our building being open, we are continuing to offer our online programs. Before I start with today's topic, I want to encourage you to pose any questions that come up using the Q&A feature of Zoom. So just find the Q&A button, click that, type in your question, and I'll be sure to make time to get to those questions at the end. Today, I'm actually returning to some documents that I talked about right at the beginning of the corona crisis, but I've uncovered some additional information and wanted to look at them again. It's also a set of documents that I've been struggling with it and trying to dig into to find more about. They include 8 postcards that were sent from Jews imprisoned in 2 different ghettos, one in Wołomin, Poland, and one in the Czech city of Terezin, which the Germans renamed after 1938's annexation of the Sudetenland as Theresienstadt. And just a word about Polish pronunciations. As you may know, the W in Polish is pronounced like the English V, while the L with a line through it is pronounced like the English W. And so what looks to the American reader as Wolomin is pronounced in Polish Wołomin. Anyway, the ghettos of Wołomin and Terezin offer insights into the various different types of ghettos that existed under Nazi rule and some of the similarities between these ghettos too. I want to say a special word of thanks to the people who donated these postcards to our collection, Miriam Fingerhut and Phyllis and Stanley Sanders. Sadly, Stanley Sanders passed away a couple of years ago, but I'm personally grateful to Phyllis Sanders and Miriam Fingerhut for taking the time to talk to me about their family histories and to help me understand these documents. Okay, so we have 4 postcards each from these 2 different ghettos, with the 4 from Wołomin coming from 1941 and the 4 from Terezin coming in 1943 and early 1944. The dates of the postcards are noteworthy, but before I get to that, let me back up and say a few words about the Nazi plan that led to the creation of these ghettos. Almost immediately after invading Poland on September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany planned to centralize and contain the Jewish population in ghettos that were to be established in major cities. The ghettos were a key step in the Nazi process of brutally separating and persecuting Jews. They were planned as enclosed districts that isolated the Jewish population from the new non-Jewish populations and where living conditions were made deplorable. I want to emphasize that the Nazi plan to place Jews in ghettos was developed before the Nazis came up with the genocide plan. The Nazis' initial plan in 1939 was not the murder of all the Jews, but their containment and their expulsion. The ghettos were initially developed as a step towards expulsion, although they later became a central component of the Nazi genocide. This slide gives you a sense of the ghettos that the Nazis left in their wake as they rushed through Poland. In all, the Nazis created some 1,100 ghettos. Let me go back to our postcards. The 4 earlier ones were sent from the ghetto in Wołomin, a small town about 25 kilometers northeast of Warsaw. A look at the front side of our postcards provides us with some basic information. You can see this was mailed to a Mr. Hyman Weber in New York. Let me add that Hyman, who went by Chaim in America, was married to a woman named Rachel. So Chaim and Rachel Weber were the recipients of this and the other postcards in our collection. You can also see that this was a pre-printed postcard designed to be sent to the United States, which was still possible in 1941 because this was before Pearl Harbor. America was not at war with Germany, and thus mail continued between occupied Poland and America. And we can see it was sent from Mordko Ostrega. Mordko is a Polish form of the Hebrew name Mordechai, and Mordko was married to a woman named Bathsheba, the only one of Rachel and Chaim's 5 children to still be in Poland in 1939. And you can see in the return address where Mordko and Bathsheba were living. They write they are in Wołomin, and then the address is Osada Sosnovka, which translates to the Sosnovka district or the Sosnovka ghetto. These postcards were donated to the museum by Stanley Sanders and his wife Phyllis. Stanley was a major force in the creation of our museum before he passed away in 2018, and Phyllis is a member of our board, so I'm grateful to her. Stanley's grandparents, Rachel and Chaim, were the recipients of these postcards, and it was Stanley's uncle and aunt in Wołomin who sent them. Wołomin is not a very well-known ghetto, as an example of one of the Nazis' smaller ghettos. Wołomin had a population of somewhere around 17,000 people in 1939, about 2,700 of whom were Jews. In November of 1939, a month after the Nazi invasion, Jews in Wołomin were ordered to wear the yellow star to identify them and separate them as Jews. And in November of 1940, a year later, they were forced into the town's ghetto, an area near the railroad line that ran through the town. The postcards in our collection were sent between February and September of 1941, so beginning about 4 months after the ghetto was established. But when you read the postcards, they seem relatively benign. There are frequent references to the need for food. One thanks Rachel and Chaim for sending flour, buckwheat, macaroni, and salami. Another says, we ask that if you send us more packages, send only packages with food. But there's nothing about the harsh restrictions that were imposed in the ghetto. There's nothing about the crowding or the limitations on work or their starvation diet that was being enforced. And we'll see the benign language is something that's repeated in the postcards that were sent from Terezin too. The reason, of course, was that even though mail was allowed, all outgoing letters and postcards were reviewed by German censors to make sure outsiders would not learn about Nazi atrocities. A description from a different survivor from a different ghetto listed the following 16 decrees that limited life for Jews in that slightly larger ghetto in Drohobitz, near Lvov. There was forced labor, which nobody was paid for. Every Jewish resident from the age of 10 had to wear the Star of David. It was forbidden to keep your hands in your pockets. You had to give priority to Germans if they were crossing the street near you. You couldn't cross the main street in the central square. You couldn't own any kind of animal. You couldn't use electricity. You couldn't purchase stuff from farmers. You couldn't eat meat. You couldn't use any mass conveyance or motorized conveyance. There were all kinds of restrictions imposed. One survivor who later recounted what happened in Wołomin said the following: with the arrival of the Germans, every day brought with it new decrees, and the committee was required to provide more and more people for forced labor. Food prices skyrocketed, and those who did not have valuables to exchange with the farmers in the area suffered from starvation. The first victims began to fall. Jews were murdered for no reason. There were gendarmes who killed Jews just for the pleasure of murder and without having to explain the reason. Only a notice was sent to the Judenrat, the Jewish management of the ghetto, about the place where the body of the murdered Jew was lying, and the committee was responsible for burial. When rumors grew that the turn of Sosnovka ghetto for deportation and extermination was drawing near, it's impossible to describe the panic and the depression that have taken place. The sound of crying, prayers, and pleading came from every Jewish home. Everyone felt his end was coming. People were running around like in a trap, searching for refuge in times of trouble, but all the roads were desolated and blocked. Bathsheba and Mordko couldn't write these things in their postcards, but it's possible that they tried to write something that would create a warning, something that would have been jarring to Rachel and Chaim in New York and would have alerted them that something was wrong back in Wołomin. But it's hard to read between the lines today and recognize what would have been strange or out of place in 1941. There is one example that seems strange given what we know, but it's hardly a clear statement of danger. In a postcard from March 1st, 1941, where the date is clearly written, Mordko starts, "Dear parents, we received your postcards and we want to congratulate you on Dora's marriage. We wish her lots of luck. We're in good health." Dora was Bathsheba's sister, who had moved to New York with her parents before the war started. The odd thing about this part of the postcard is that Dora had not recently gotten married. She'd been married for a full year and indeed had just given birth to her first son. Mordka and Bathsheba certainly knew that Dora's marriage was nothing new, so this seems strange to write. This is the type of thing that might have made Rachel and Chaim stop and question what was going on back in Wołomin to make Mordko and Bathsheba write this. It's just that kind of strange thing that might have set off an alarm bell for Chaim and Rachel. We do know of other cases where the writer and the recipient decided on a secret code before the family was separated. We have, for instance, a watercolor in our museum painted by a teenager in the Terezin ghetto named Marietta Grunbaum. Marietta's mother, brother, and aunt were all in the ghetto with her. And when her aunt was notified that she was going to be placed on a train for resettlement, the aunt told Marietta's mother that she would try to send a letter after she got to her new destination. And they agreed that if the letter were written on a slant going up, it would mean that all was well and she was fine. If, on the other hand, the letter was written with a slantward down, that would mean there was trouble. This is the picture of the letter Marietta's mother finally received from her sister. As you can see, the text is subtly slanted down, not in a way that would make a censor notice, but clearly enough for Marietta's mother to realize that the term resettlement that the Nazis were using was something to avoid. I also recently came across another story about a woman who was in the Ravensbrück prison or concentration camp, who used urine as a way to write with invisible ink on the outside envelope of a letter she sent to some family. The family knew that to heat the letter would make the ink possible to see. So this is just another example of a different way that secret messages were gotten out of the camps. But if they were found out, of course, it meant a great deal of punishment to the person who's writing them. But as I say, we don't know if the postcards for Wołomin included a particular code or included invisible writing. And unfortunately, there was little that Rachel and Chaim could have done in March of 1941, except try to help get Bathsheba and Mordko out of Poland, which they appear to have been working on, and to send food, although there was no guarantee that any food they sent would actually make it into the ghetto. And before any headway could be made on getting Bathsheba and Mordko out, on October 3rd, 1942, the Jews in Wołomin, as the survivor recounted, were marched to the railroad track and forced onto trains to Treblinka. This is one of the very few photographs of those Jews being marched to the trains. Amazingly, the family reports that Bathsheba survived the war, but not much more is known because after that, she was swept behind the Iron Curtain as Russia moved through Poland. As to Mordko or any of the other names mentioned in the postcards, it's likely they were murdered in Treblinka, where between 700,000 and 900,000 Jews were murdered, and only 67 escaped alive. The other 4 postcards we have come from a more well-known ghetto, the one established in Terezin or Theresienstadt in German. Known as a model ghetto that the Nazis used to promote the lie to the Red Cross and around the world that these camps were treating the inmates well, the fact is that at Theresienstadt, almost 90% of the Jews sent there were murdered. The first deportees from Prague arrived in what had been a fortress town of Terezin in November of 1941. But by the middle of 1942, the original non-Jewish population had been evicted, and trainloads of German, Bohemian, and Austrian Jews had been brought in their place. At the Wannsee Conference in Berlin in January of 42, Reinhard Heydrich had gotten broad agreement about the implementation of the mass murder of all the Jews of Europe, but had also agreed that German Jews, particularly those with friends in high places or who had served with distinction in the German military during World War I, or those whose disappearance might be problematic in any way, those Jews were to be deported to Theresienstadt rather than sent directly to gas chambers. These Jews were told that they would be permitted to buy an apartment in Terezin by signing over their property to the Nazis. But when they arrived in Terezin, they were forced into crowded dormitories with minimal hygiene and forced into starvation diets. By September of 1942, 53,000 people were living in Theresienstadt, a town that had been home to only 8,000 a year earlier. It's hard to imagine the overcrowding. Mass deportations to Theresienstadt ended by the middle of 1943. By then, the combination of high mortality rates and outward deportations to Auschwitz or other killing centers had reduced the crowding. By the end of October of 44, only 11,000 people remained in Theresienstadt. One of the families that remained in October of 1944 wrote the postcards in our exhibition. Here's the front of one of those cards. You can see it was sent to a Dr. Ilsa Rainov in Sofia, Bulgaria. Because Bulgaria was an Axis ally, mail continued between German-occupied Theresienstadt and Sofia. I think you can make out that the card was sent from Rosie Philipson, and you can see the return address is Theresienstadt, Badhausgasse 1, or number 1 Bathhouse Alley. We can even find that building on a map of the fortress turned camp. The map, of course, does nothing to convey the crowding, poor sanitation, or starvation. Rosie Philipson and her husband Ferdinand had lived in the small hamlet of Feldberg, northeast of Berlin before the war. We have a picture of Ferdinand Philipson on the wall of photographs that stands at the entrance to our museum. Ferdinand, I think, comes across as strong and confident in the photograph. He was in his 60s when this picture was taken, so a mature but healthy man in 1934 with 2 adult children, Ilsa, who was the recipient of the postcards, and Hans, his son. Ilsa appears to have seen the writing on the wall earlier than the rest of the family and fled Germany after Hitler came to power, settling in Bulgaria where she thought she would be safe and where she worked as a pediatrician. Ferdinand and Rosie decided to stay in Feldberg, but things got difficult. In 1937, Ferdinand was forced to sell his successful dry goods and clothing store to new Aryan owners for only a fraction of its value. And a year later, during the pogrom known as Kristallnacht, he was taken into what the Nazis called protective custody, but it meant placing in a detention center in a neighboring town, and in this case, he suffered a stroke during that detention and was then released. His son Hans, who was living in Stuttgart in 1938, was also arrested on Kristallnacht, eventually getting released with the help of his sister and some English relatives who provided the paperwork to allow him to move to England, and he later actually fought in Dunkirk. As an aside, Hans, who changed his name to Frank in England, would later marry a woman named Ruth Arnfeld, who we have also in our photo wall in our first gallery. She had also escaped from Germany to England thanks to some well-timed letters of support. And it was their daughter Miriam, who later moved to the United States and settled in Nassau County, who donated the postcards along with other family documents to our museum. Ferdinand and Rosie, despite the events of 1937 and 1938, stayed in Feldberg, and things seemed to settle down. But in November of 1942, they were arrested and taken to Berlin. And then on November 19th, 1942, deported to Theresienstadt. So just about the same time that the Jews in Wołomin were being sent to Treblinka, Ferdinand and Rosie were being deported to Theresienstadt. The first of the postcards we have is written by Ferdinand in April of 1943, a little over 4 months after having arrived in Theresienstadt. Unable to write in detail, about the horrendous conditions or the terror over which they were facing, the postcard text is not really notable. He writes, "I'm happy to be able to tell you today that Mother and I are healthy. We hope to hear the same from you and look forward to receiving news soon. The mail here works regularly. Postcards, letters, parcels are permitted and arrive promptly. If we cannot answer soon because the mail is overloaded, please do keep us constantly informed. We think and talk about all of you a lot. How are the dear children? Best wishes for all of you for Feldberg and Berlin." But if you look at the handwriting, it hardly suggests the upbeat tone of the letter. I know the top of this image is a bit dark, but you can see the crossouts, the jittery hand, the sloppiness. I think you can make those out. Here's a zoomed in view of a portion of the letter. You might think, okay, it's not surprising for someone who had suffered a stroke to write in this jittery hand, but other letters from Ferdinand show a smooth and confident hand. The handwriting in this postcard may well have been written as a way to suggest that all was not so well as the words proclaimed. Miriam Fingerhut, who donated the postcards to us, also drew my attention to another strange reference in a note written 3 months later in August of '43 by Rosie Philipson. Again, to the casual reader, the letter does not appear noteworthy. She writes, "I want to thank you so much for your good wishes for my birthday and your cards from June. We were very happy to hear good news from you. We are also well. Father received postcards and 3 parcels from sisters Clara and Kate," that's Ferdinand's sister and sister-in-law, "which we enjoyed very much. We are delighted to hear that you and the children are developing so well and making good progress. Unfortunately, Uncle Kurt and Aunt Berta died of old age. I hope that we'll hear again from you soon. We join you in your good wishes. Warmest wishes to you all from Father." The strange reference in this letter is Uncle Kurt and Aunt Berta died of old age. Uncle Kurt and Aunt Berta were only in their early 30s in 1943. Ilse would certainly have known that they were not elderly, and would have recognized that they had not died actually from old age. It's just a subtle reference and hardly a clear warning, but perhaps a red flag and something to suggest to Ilse that all was not as it seemed. That's about all that Ferdinand and Rosie could do as they watched those around them die or be deported. We do have one more postcard from Rosie in January of 1944 that again reads as if nothing bad is happening. But only a few months later, on June 2nd, 1944, Rosie died in Theresienstadt, apparently from starvation. Ferdinand survived and was liberated in 1945, evacuated back to Frankfurt. He then returned to Feldberg, where he tried unsuccessfully to get his store back. According to the records kept by the Nazis, of the 100 people who were deported to Theresienstadt with Ferdinand and Rosie on November 19th, 1942, Ferdinand was only one of 10 to survive the war. Rosie was part of the 90% who were murdered. I'm going to stop there. I will admit that these are difficult documents, I think, to work with because on their face, they appear to report that nothing is out of ordinary in the ghettos. But as I've tried to suggest today, a close reading and some context suggests that there is much more to them than what they initially seem to offer, and that indeed they open up a world onto secret communication that may be hard for us to even find out about today. Anyway, thank you for joining me today on our pre-Thanksgiving Day program. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A window and I'll do what I can to answer them. Before I do that though, let me mention a few other things about our current temporary exhibition and some of our upcoming virtual programs. I want to highlight once again that we have reopened our galleries, although we're going to be closed for Thanksgiving and Friday and Saturday, but we strongly encourage visitors to contact us in advance and reserve tickets for timed entry, as we do have strict limits on the number of people that can be in our galleries. We're open generally from Monday to Friday for walk-ins and closed on Saturday, open again on Sunday by pre-made reservations. And one thing you might be interested in seeing in our museum is our new temporary exhibition that just opened earlier this month, The Holocaust Through the Eyes of a Survivor's Daughter, Sculptures by Tamima. The temporary exhibit includes 30 sculptures by an acclaimed artist here in Nassau County who processes both her mother's experience during the Holocaust and her own experience as the child of a survivor through her art. In terms of programs, Next Wednesday, December 2nd, we have 2 virtual programs. At 10, we're holding our virtual chair yoga, which is appropriate for all ages and abilities. And then at noon, I'll be running my next Curator's Corner, looking at some Weimar era currency that we have in our galleries. And next Thursday, December 3rd at 7 p.m., I hope you'll join us for a virtual challah baking demonstration. Join us to learn how to make, braid, and bake homemade challah. You can find details about these and all of our programs on our website at www.hmtcli.org under the Events tab. I also hope you'll go to our website and click the Give Now button to make a donation to support the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. Okay, let me take a look and see if I can answer some of your questions. Somebody's asking just if there was any handout for this. There is no handout, but this has been recorded, and so we're going to be putting this on our website so people can watch it. And I will send a link to everybody who